welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the show, my name is Irina Zuckerman and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Today we have a book talk about something both classical, enduring, and also with very significant contemporary implications. And we are talking about the solving of a 2000 plus a year old mystery, and I'm using the word in it's a bit of a trick point, as we'll see very shortly, of the circumstances surrounding the execution of Socrates and the historical context that could explain why exactly his life was so ruthlessly ended, and more importantly, by whom. And the author of the book that sheds lights on these fantastic developments, you can see the book right here. It's called The Shadows of Socrates, is Matt Gatton, who is based in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and he's a pioneer of the study of ritual and aesthetic use of physical light in prehistory and classical antiquity. And his work has been published by the Journal of Applied Mathematics. He is also an artist, and you can see some of the beautiful paintings right behind him, and overall a great public intellectual. So Matt, thank you so much for joining the program today. And before we get into the very complex and yet thrilling read that was your book, let's talk a little bit about you, your background. How did you end up doing both art and this very, very science-driven intellectual pursuit? And how did what is it about? Is there a connection about your artistic endeavors and your intellectual scientific studies?
Oh, indeed, indeed. Thanks for the question. I think what ties them together is light. So um, so I got really interested in ancient Greek history as a small child. That's sort of the starting point. So I had this Greek great grandparent who had passed long before I was born. And there was this picture of him on the wall. And it was one of those old oval frames with the convex glass over it. And I was mesmerized by it. So staring at his face, and I guess him peering back at me, something happened there. And the house was stacked floor to ceiling with books. So I'm sure they were putting ancient Greek books in front of me. And particularly, I was obsessed with ancient Greek portraiture. So in grade school, the instructor asked the class to say, what person living or dead with whom would you most like to speak? And all the boys in the class picked Evel Knievel, who was a motorcycle stuntman, right? He was huge at the time. I mean, I think his audience share was 52% of all the television sets in America were tuned to his jumps. So, which is more than any Super Bowl before or since. But I chose Phidias, who was the ancient Greek sculptor who made the monumental sculpture of Athena that was in the Parthenon. So the interest in ancient Greek aesthetics and in portraiture started very early. So I think one commonality you could see here is I'm doing a portrait of Socrates via light in the book, and I'm a portraitist as well when I do visual art.
Now, this is fascinating for one reason. There's a little bit of this stereotype about the right versus left brain people, the scientists and the, explorers versus the artistic types. But if Renaissance tells us anything, is that actually most of their, many of the famed classicists have been very much both. Leonardo da Vinci is just one of them, but Michelangelo and everyone else studied science before engaging in art, in sculpture and painting, and certainly the ancient Greeks did as well. Science, a lot of the architecture and sculpture was very much science driven. So how is it, so clearly the bridging of those worlds is not as, as far from reality as we think, but somehow the stereotype persists. And how to deal with that, with this idea of being able to bring in different fields of study into and make these connections between art, history, and hard science that requires a scientific method experimentation.
Right. Well, it is indeed a very ancient Greek thing to do, to combine those all together. So there's a great quote from the Oxford art historian Martin Kemp, who writes quite a lot about art and science and where they meet. So the quote from Kemp goes, "True art and science begin where knowledge ends." I'll repeat that. True art and science begin where knowledge ends. So the point being that you are exploring the great unknown. You're taking what you know and using it to probe the unknown. So both science and art are methods, if you will, of exploration.
Now, you actually mentioned the use of experimental scientific methods in your book, and I will not go into details of what that is specifically and how you did it. But what I would like to know is how were you able to do that? Did you study science? And how did you specifically manage to, I would say, arrange this unique field of study that I think many people may not necessarily be familiar with. I'm being charitable here.
Yeah. So my expertise was light, what light can do. So archaeologists began to approach me and ask me um, questions where they had problems. Now, archaeologists cannot dig up a chunk of light. So, but light is a really important part of how humans operate. So they would look at built spaces and material culture and try to figure out what was happening with the light. So I began working in Paleolithic with Paleolithic archaeologists, then Neolithic archaeologists, and then I was presented this question about this temple in ancient Greece as to whether we could perform a light experiment that would answer as yet unanswered question. See, the thing about light is light behaves the same way across time, which means you can ask a question of it, perform an experiment, and get an answer, because light is eternal and it behaves the same way always. So, but to get back to your specific question, so within the field of archaeology, there's a subdiscipline called experimental archaeology, where you go back and you try to rebuild or recreate some event, action, or structure, or as simple as learning how to knap blades or rebuild Paleolithic huts. And within this field of reconstruction archaeology or experimental archaeology is the field of archaeoastronomy, which figures out how built spaces align to celestial events, most often the sun on the horizon. So a sunrise or sunset, normally a winter solstice or a summer solstice, and occasionally an equinox. So I'm the co-founder of a field called archaeooptics, where we just turn the attention 180 degrees around. Instead of looking out from the structure to see where the sun is, look the other direction at what the light is doing inside the space.
So I'm guessing the Stonehenge would probably figure quite prominently among the students, as well as various types of pyramids around the world.
Right. So the while Stonehenge is you know, the an icon, I was more interested in passage tombs. And those are tumuli, mounds that have
Mm-hmm.
a passageway that leads to a crypt. The most famous one is Newgrange
Mm-hmm.
in Ireland, but they are scattered across the Atlantic facade of Europe. The country, do you know which country has the most extant passage tombs?
Um,
Denmark. Denmark.
no,
Denmark has more.
really? I would never have.
Yeah. Oh, and they're well taken care of and they're open access. But you know, they're in Spain, they're in
Mhm.
France, Goffrey in France is another in Brittany. That's another famous one. So, and they go back like, you know,
So,
uh,
so
thousands and thousands and thousands of years.
So this is fascinating. You're bringing together all these disciplines to understand the nature of light, and light plays a central role in the book, even though the book is a history in some ways. It's a reconstruction of events that, on their basic level are familiar to anyone who's taken a basic philosophy course at college, but to most people, or even to many of those who have not. But anything deeper than that has been sort of quite unfamiliar to most. So how did you arrive on the specific story of Socrates and resolving the controversies and the um, unknowns around his death, his execution? Was it your philosophical background that prompted you into the specific area, or was there something concrete that caused you to look into that particular subject?
Right, right. So initially I wasn't, although I love philosophy and I'm an avid reader, I was not intending to do more study on Socrates. Um, the book is explains how Socrates was set up, who did it, and why. Of course, we all know he gets killed. He has to drink the hemlock. He gets executed. Um, but the prosecution's case was not recorded, so it's left uh, open for lots and lots of speculation over the last 2,400 years. Um, so Socrates was charged with two crimes. One was impiety, which is a religious crime. Impiety means lack of reverence for the gods. The second part of his crime was corrupting the youth. So to get at what Socrates was charged with and why, you have to understand those two charges: impiety, the religious crime, and corrupting the youth. So, but to back up, I wasn't initially focused on Socrates. I was approached by my colleague, Walter Brock, who had studied under the great classicist Guy Davenport, about the question of the mysteries of Eleusis. Now, the mysteries of Eleusis were a central religious ritual of ancient Athens. The Temple of Eleusis is 14 miles outside of Athens. You can visit its ruins to this day. And there would be this grand procession from satellite temple on the Acropolis or on the slopes of the Acropolis, where then the whole contingent, the priests and all the initiates would hike through the graveyard all the way to the Temple of Eleusis, and there they would have this mind-altering experience. So the gods at the Temple of Eleusis it's dedicated to the goddess Demeter and the goddess Persephone. So Persephone, as you know, is the goddess of the underworld and the overworld. Like, she spends half the year below the ground, half the year above ground. Um, so the initiates are taking this hike, this procession out to this temple where they will have an experience of death. They're going to go through some horrible things in the dark, and then they will come upon this epiphany, if you will, which ancient Greek for appearance, where the goddess Persephone shows up as this phasmatophos, as this apparition of light, and then she blesses the initiates with a blissful afterlife. So the way the afterlife works in the ancient Greek context, and again, with a tradition that long, it changes over time. But when you die, you go to Hades. And in Hades, there's this island called the Elysium, which is named after Eleusis. And then that island is the closest thing that we have is the concept of heaven. Like this is just the pure bliss afterlife. So once you've been initiated into the mysteries, you've earned a blissful afterlife. So that's what happens at the mysteries of Eleusis. The mysteries of Eleusis is a very important ancient ritual, even though most people don't know about it. It's where we get the Eucharist. There's a baptism, like there are all these steps in this process, the washing with the water, the drinking the sacred elixir of the goddess, that end up in different forms in Christendom. So it's almost like they just plucked Persephone out of the picture, stuck in Jesus. The ritual stays the same. The ritual stays the same. So the question that was presented to me was, there's a mythological explanation for how the goddess showed up at the height of this climax of this ritual every year for almost 2,000 years. But can there be a physical explanation? So I began experimenting, looking at the archaeological diagrams, looking at the reconstructions, went to the Temple of Eleusis, did a bunch of measurements, and figured out that the priests of Eleusis were using a very simple optical trick to make the goddess appear as light. That's all I was focused on, explaining how the goddess appeared as light. What I didn't expect was the method that the priests used to create the epiphany, the appearance of the goddess as light, is remarkably similar to the situation explained in the allegory cave, which is in book 7 of Plato's Republic, where he's explaining, where he records the dialogue between Socrates and Glaucon, where Socrates explains or describes prisoners trapped in a cave who believe only the shadows that are projected by people walking by carrying sculptures in front of a great fire. And that these people, they believe in the shadows. And then Socrates asked what would happen if one of them were to be freed and was able to then turn around and see what was actually happening. Like, wouldn't they believe the shadows more than the reality that they were first looking at? So I presume everybody's read the allegory of the cave.
Well, I
So
certainly did. And those
yeah,
who didn't or who don't remember should, because it is a powerful piece and there's a reason why it stuck around with us for so long.
right. So it's this, I mean, the reason it's had such staying power is it's this amazing metaphor for the human condition and living in a world of illusion. But after doing these experiments and understanding how the mysteries of Eleusis work, and I should back up, if you were to speak publicly about the mysteries of Eleusis, you are considered to profane the mysteries of Eleusis, and you are sentenced to death. To speak of what you saw at the mysteries of Eleusis is a religious crime. That is a capital offense. So when Socrates does his allegory of the cave, which looks to be like a thinly veneered explanation of the mysteries of Eleusis, he's committing a blatant act of heresy. So that's the first part of the charge, is impiety, the religious crime. So then once I came to understand what Socrates was doing with the allegory of the cave, again, how the allegory of the cave sounds to us or reads to us 2,000 years later is very different than how it sounded to a priest of Eleusis. And that's what mattered, because their job was to protect that ritual and to kill anybody that revealed its secret.
No, it's very interesting because even without knowing the specifics of that particular religious culture and ritual, a contemporary reader can simply derive a more general context of illusion and reason versus, deception and superstition or unscientific approach, or just simply any sort of blatant, manipulation of the senses. Uh, it's interesting though that that the parallels after reading the book are very very obvious, but it is interesting that the powers involved in the final execution and the process against Socrates chose to play it up and chose to draw attention to the fact that he was in fact drawing attention, that his allegory of the cave was in fact profaning the religious rituals rather than trying to actually distance from that interpretation. Didn't they, by executing Socrates, weren't they essentially endorsing his interpretation and thus actually eliciting more skepticism from the public and validating what his comments?
Well, in a way, but the mysteries of Lucis will continue for another 800 years after
Mm-hmm.
the death of Socrates. So, I mean, this was a show that had been running for 1,000 years before Socrates was born, and it kept on, and they were. So, the way to think of this is
Mm-hmm.
to try to talk about Socrates with what happened to Socrates without discussing the mysteries of Eleusis is like trying to talk about what happened to Galileo without mentioning the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
Like this. But the thing is, Eleusis is not mentioned in the trial, or it may have been in the prosecution's case, but that's not recorded because it's so sacred, you're not allowed to talk about it. So that's another reason why, if they did talk about it in the prosecution's case, it would never have been recorded. So then but the staying power of the allegory of the cave shows you that even though Socrates knew the rules of the game, that he was willing to make this sacrifice of himself to produce this gorgeous metaphor that has had huge resonance down through the thousands of years. Like that the allegory of the cave is read to this day in cultures all over the world. Like I talk to people who come from every corner, and if I say Socrates, they know the allegory of the cave. Like it is probably the most widespread reading in the history of humanity because it's not religion specific, right? Maybe if you're a follower of Confucius, you've never read anything about Moses, or vice versa. Maybe if you're a follower of Jesus, you've never read anything about the Buddha. But everybody's read something about Socrates because it's not religious. I think what happens is once you understand how the mysteries of Eleusis operated, it changes your perception of the allegory of the cave. And then once you understand how the mysteries of Eleusis connect to the people involved in the corrupting of the youth, then your understanding of the actual trial of Socrates, which many, many people have read, changes completely.
Now, it's understandable why Socrates' unraveling of the mystery, demystifying the mysteries. uh, I was waiting for that. I was looking for a way to insert that. Why that would irk the powers that be that derived their social power from being able to manipulate the public perceptions in that particular manner. But
Right. So the body politic and the body religious are very intertwined at that point in history. There is no separation of church and state. So yeah, the powerful, so the priests of Eleusis, the officials of Eleusis, they're hereditary positions. And you have to pay to be initiated into the mysteries of Eleusis. So they make money off off of the gate fee, if you will. And
What a great
the
scheme, if not to say scam.
yeah, yeah, sure. And there are two very bad people in this uh, story, and they are half brothers. One of them ends up being the Doducha, the second highest rank at the Mysteries of Eleusis. So he has incredible power, and he's has the Mysteries of Eleusis condemn people to death all the time. So he has the power of life and death over a lot of people, and he uses it. But he is in the religion of the time. He is doing the will of the goddess, right? That's his understanding. But he's also the richest man in Athens because he owns the silver mine concession. And his half brother, who he hates, is one for the ages. I don't know if you're ready to go into that part or not.
Oh yes,
I'll
and that brings me exactly to the point. So, the religious, portion of it is pretty clear. Nobody wants, a potential, somebody, a whistleblower who is going to pull the curtain on your, little, deceptive, public deception that's making so much money, and that keeps the populace in check, and that keeps them beholden to you. I mean, it's a source of power, and for Callius especially, and it was a source of power not just in absolute terms, objectively speaking, but vis-a-vis his half brother Alcibiades, the military counterpart to the religious rule of law. So this Alcibiades, he was a student of Socrates, and that was part of the problem. The portrait of
oh
this
yeah.
character that goes through all sorts of um adventures and switches sides politically multiple times throughout the story, and seems to gravitate to any faction and uh state and power that can save him from his own past and elevate him to power. This character is at the center of this controversy, and he may be the indirect reason for accusations of the corruption of the youth against uh, Socrates, albeit decades after the events in question. So the question is, what is it about the rivalry about of these two half brothers and their quest for power? And what is it Alcibiades' approach to power and his personality that drives so much of this historic chain of events that ends in tragedy for Socrates, who clearly did not intend to corrupt anyone? I mean, it's so obvious from the context.
Yeah, it's man, it is quite the tale. So the second part of the charge against Socrates is corrupting the youth. So it's important to know who the youth are and
Mhm.
what sort of corrupt things they did. So a couple of Socrates' former students are going to destroy the state. Um, Democracy falls twice during the heyday of Socrates, each time triggering a civil war. So it is ugly. So backing up to the two half brothers, Alcibiades and Callias. So Alcibiades and Callias are raised in the house of the great Athenian general Pericles. The golden age of Athens, where they build the Parthenon, where they expand the Delian League, that's rightly called the age of Pericles. He's probably one of the greatest public speakers of all time. His funeral oration for Athens' war dead really serves as a template for Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. So, I mean, people study the classics and it pays off. So what happens is Alcibiades' father gets killed in battle. So then Alcibiades' mother, who's a cousin of Pericles, moves into Pericles' house with this young boy. Now, Callias' father, Hipponicus, is the wealthiest man in Athens, but his wife divorces him and then marries Pericles. So you get these two boys from separate aristocratic lineages, perhaps each feeling superior to the other, uh, being melded into this sort of Brady Bunch situation, right? Now, Pericles has two sons of his own. So he has two legitimate heirs who are going to take over when he retires or dies. The problem is that a plague cuts through Athens, and it kills Pericles and both his legitimate heirs. And that opens up a path to power for Callias and Alcibiades. So Callias, again, he's going to be the richest man in Athens, and he's going to be an Eleusinian official, an official of the mysteries. And Alcibiades has a direct path to becoming a general. Like that's what his family does. Now, Alcibiades is probably a psychopath. He will do anything, say anything. He's incredibly cruel. He's a sex addict. He's so Alcibiades and Callias have this sort of war between brothers about who's going to control Athens once they hit adulthood. So Callias, okay, so let me back up. Alcibiades is about to take the army to conquer Syracuse. So he's a general. He's got all the ships are there, all the soldiers are there. And a couple days before he's about to lead this army, Callias charges him with profaning the mysteries. Now, maybe Alcibiades did it because he's a jerk like that, or maybe he didn't. Either way, Callias is going to get rid of him. So Alcibiades, being Alcibiades, he escapes. He's impeached. He doesn't show up for his trial. He gets sentenced to death in absentia. He flees and he turns traitor to Athens' dread enemy, Sparta. And once he's with Sparta, he knows everything about how the Athenian military, how its defenses work, and he coaches up, he guides Sparta in how to conquer Athens. And the first step he takes is he tells them to take the silver mines, which of course belong to his half-brother Callias. So his first thing he does is he talks to Spartans. Now, he doesn't tell the Spartans why he's doing, he always just tells them, this is the way you do this. Cut off their money. And the Spartans go, yeah, that's a great idea. But the first thing he does, he cuts off Athens' access to money and Callias, source of Callias' wealth. And then he has them occupy a place called Decelea, which then cuts off Athens' access to the mysteries of Eleusis. So like the first two steps are entirely aimed at his half-brother, who's already sentenced him to death. So Athens and Socrates are caught in the middle of this thing. So he has the Spartans then lay siege to Athens. Athens is a walled city, so they're well defended, but they can't get food or supplies in over land. So everything has to come in by boat. The thing to always remember is that Athens has the superior navy, Sparta has the superior ground forces. So Athens is being crushed. They're being starved to death. And Socrates is one of the defenders running the ramparts. What people don't realize about Socrates is that he was a war hero. He fought in 3 campaigns, and he was just an absolute beast. He could go without food, he could go without water, he could go without sleep, and he fought like a bear. Like he's a warrior hero in Athens. Like that's part of his personality that people don't know about. But when the siege of Athens is happening, Socrates has like a little baby. Like, I mean, his wife has like he's trying to keep his kid alive. So even if he can go without food, he's trying to keep his baby alive. And he knows that it's his ex-student Alcibiades who's out there trying to destroy Athens. So to a little bit about the history of Alcibiades and Callias. So to your point, Alcibiades was a student of Socrates, even though he probably taught Socrates the most important lesson, which is morality cannot be taught. Like Alcibiades was amoral from the get-go, and there's nothing that Socrates could do with him that worked. So when Alcibiades was just a young teenager, he was part of a military campaign, and he went out beyond the Athenian lines, got himself cut down, was basically a dead man for all intents and purposes. And then Socrates fights his way out to where Alcibiades lays wounded and unable to move, and puts his feet on either side of Alcibiades and fights off the enemy with his sword. And then when there's a break in the action, he throws Alcibiades on his shoulders and carries him back behind Athenian lines where his bleeding could be stanched and he could be saved. So Alcibiades just becomes this devoted follower of Socrates because Socrates saved his life. And they would go on to fight in another campaign. So they had this sort of bond that is only known by people who fought in war together and who saved each other's life. So then Alcibiades becomes Socrates' like #1 student. Like he soaks up everything he can from Socrates about forms of government and weaknesses of forms of government, and then he takes all that information and uses it for evil.
This is so fascinating because through all these peripeties, to use another great Greek word, Alcibiades goes around double crossing all these people. He's completely self-serving. He always has an ulterior motive for anything he does, and yet after all these multiple, backstabbing efforts, he always still finds somebody who buys into his act, and sometimes it's the same people he's double crossed before, including Athenians. So the question is, how does he manage to pull it off? Why are people so gullible and so oblivious, or even willing to put aside their concerns about his personality, his record of actions? Forget his personality, his actual record of doing things that are obviously damaging.
Yeah, that's wow. That's if you knew that, you'd be able to explain why dictators continue to occur across time. So Alcibiades is the handsomest man in the ancient world. He is a persuasive public speaker, probably second only to Pericles in the history of the earth. And he's so manipulative, so smooth. And again, he's probably had sex with every man and woman in Athens and Sparta. Like, so he's just got a way of working things out. So when he's in Sparta and Sparta is crushing Athens, you're going to understand why people in Athens are going to have strong feelings about Alcibiades because they're being starved and killed because of Alcibiades. Throughout history, teachers get credit for their good students, and for Socrates, that's Plato. And even to this day, teachers get a certain amount of blame for their poor performing students. And for Socrates, that's Alcibiades. So they're going to look to blame somebody for all the stuff that Alcibiades does. And his teacher is going to be an easy mark because there's nobody more corrupt than Alcibiades. So he's in Sparta. He's taught them how to defeat Athens. Athens is barely holding on. And then Alcibiades gets the Spartan queen Timea pregnant. The Spartan king is not happy about this at all. So then the Spartan king puts an execution order on Alcibiades. So Alcibiades has to flee Sparta. So he flees Sparta. So now there's a death sentence against him in Athens and in Sparta. So all of Greece wants him dead. So he goes to the Persians, the great Persian Empire, which at this point includes Turkey, and he schmoozes himself up to the governor of that Persian province and says, "Hey, I can teach you how to defeat Greece and get Greece into your domain." So he's a turncoat on a turncoat on a turncoat. And the thing is, okay, again, he is a braggart. He's a wealthy guy, aristocrat. He tells this incredible lie that causes Athens to take down its democracy, which triggers a civil war. Then from abroad, he takes advantage of the civil war he caused and makes a drive to return to power. Shockingly, after years of being out of office in Athens, the Athenian assembly votes him in as autocrat. So this is his second go at power in Athens. Now, he has already unleashed a bunch of dominoes that as they fall are going to end with Sparta taking control of Athens. So once Alcibiades is back in Athens and it has a second term, if you will, Athens goose is cooked. Athens goes from being a crown jewel of the ancient world with its architecture, its art, its philosophy, its science, its medicine, to being crushed by Sparta in a few years' time, all because of one man's fragile, almost childlike ego. So there are, to your point, there are lessons to learn. How does somebody who continues to cause harm to people continue to be chosen as their leader? So I don't know. Can I read you a passage?
Yes, please.
Okay. So at this point, let's see. Athens has, I'll have to put on my glasses because I'm old.
Oh, please.
Okay, so Alcibiades is back in Athens. He's been named autocrat, which means he has sole control of the military. Normally, control of the military is power in the military is divided between several generals. Now he's the sole general. Now that makes him the autocrat. So they the people now want to name him tyrant. A tyrant then gets sole political power. So if he gets sole political power with sole military power, then he becomes like a king. So Callias, his half brother, who's tried to kill him before, is really scared of the idea of Alcibiades being named tyrant, because he knows for sure Alcibiades is going to kill him. So this is what Socrates, this is so now I'm going to go to Socrates' perspective on tyrants. There's no word on Socrates' feelings about the chatters of Alcibiades being named tyrant, but Socrates' perspective on tyrants in general is well recorded by Plato. To Socrates, the flaw of democracy is its vulnerability to tyrants. The populace, the mob as he calls them, are gullible and can easily fall under the spell of a charismatic leader. Alcibiades certainly fits the bill. In Socrates' estimation, the tyrant first appears as a protector. The people have something they fear, either inside or outside of the state, either real or imagined, from which the tyrant claims he can guard them. He will make them the victors. The people flock to him of their own accord, for he pays them in lies. Lies they want to hear, lies they want to believe. They are superior. They are true patriots. His favorite tools are false accusations and unleashing his mob against the threat. In time, the tyrant erases any and all opposition, with unholy tongue and lips tasting the blood of his fellow citizens. He and his supporters are empowered by the purge, and the more detestable his actions, the greater devotion he requires from his followers. These words are as true in the modern world as they were in ancient Athens. Many countries today still struggle with this structural defect of democracy. The majority of the populace in a democracy may elect a tyrant who will invariably disassemble the democracy that elected him. A democracy can make a tyrant, but a tyrant can unmake a democracy. The weak portions of the populace yearns to be strong, so they attach themselves to a strong man, such as the allure of the bully, the appeal of the despot, the attraction of the tyrant. Ancient Athens is where democracy first began and first fell, and so can teach us lessons that are, unfortunately, still applicable. But for Socrates, the would-be tyrant is Alcibiades, who is, at least partially, one of Socrates' own making. Socrates had once before caused Athens to take down its democracy based on his outrageous lie and install an oligarchy that sparked a civil war. And he wasn't even in Athens at the time. Now he's in Athens and well positioned to take down Athens' democracy once again, but this time to replace it with his own tyranny.
You know, a lot of it seems very familiar, and we've seen this historically time and again, a combination of a, you know, external conditions, a charismatic personality, complete lack of ethics, populist demagoguery, and we get somebody, who manages to inspire enough people to follow him blindly. We have seen that with Weimar Germany. The Nazis never attained the majority, but the hijacking of the minds of these, allegedly cultured college students and intellectuals and all of these people who saw an opportunity in what was being sold to them. They were being sold a bag of goods, and this victimization complex of, and all this demagoguery, they fell right through it. And we're certainly seeing a lot of the same sort of social polarization at play today. And we're certainly seeing outcries from some people who are, at first used democracy to try to advance themselves, and now are claiming that democracy should be dead, that it is a form of government that's ill-suited, and that people just want a strong leader with no democracy, and they're calling for its complete dismantlement altogether. And enough people, are buying into it that they don't see the contradictions and illogic in this rhetoric. And in 2000 plus years, we have not learned a thing from these historic parallels. And it didn't help that people weren't aware of all the circumstances that happened. But geopolitically, we're also seeing some parallels that you pointed out about the importance of the Black Sea, for instance, and the importance, what happens if one power monopolizes access to the waters and transference of grain. We are seeing the same thing with Ukraine today, and we are seeing that it goes well beyond Ukraine. Just recently, for instance, France complained about being, threatened by Russian weapons. And what happens if Russia takes control of the Black Sea and ends freedom of navigation for other countries in the region? That we have seen what happens when parts of, Greece and the near-lying areas were monopolized. So how do we, import these historical lessons? And something's clearly not changing. Personality traits don't change. Popular mentality doesn't change. The way social psychology doesn't change, and certainly geopolitical, strategic choke points also don't change. How do we transfer these lessons in a way that can be easily absorbed by the very public that is assailed by Socrates?
Yeah, that's the big question, because after democracy dies in antiquity, it doesn't come back until these United States of America. That's a really, really long time. And then throughout the 20th century, the 1900s, democracies fell here and there to tyrants. And so it's a fundamental flaw in democracy that Socrates explained that continues to be exploited by certain personality types. Now, when James Madison went about constructing the United States Constitution, he had studied the classics, and he tried to build in all these checks and balances to make sure that this vulnerability to tyrants would not work in the modern American context. So, but I believe those have been stretched to the limit, and they're being stretched to the limit in other places who've sort of adopted that method. But back to your just to give the audience some context about the Black Sea. So the Black Sea does come up in the book, The Shadows of Socrates, because once Sparta has Athens completely surrounded, and all of Athens' food has to come in by boat, Sparta then finds a way to cut off the route across the Black Sea from Europe's breadbasket, from Ukraine, to for boats to bring grain to Athens. And one of the reasons that Athens warms back up to Alcibiades is he goes and now that he's with Persia, he conquers some Spartan outposts, which then gives Athens the ability to get grain from what is now Ukraine to Athens. So Alcibiades, like any other despot does do things for a certain amount of population to get them to love him. Now, Alcibiades, at his core, what he does is he turns half the population against the other half by lying. And that is a tried and true method for rulers today, and certainly over the last century. But your question to how do democratic institutions survive would be tyrant. If we look back at history, they often don't, and it often ends up being gruesome. I mean, whether it's Pinochet or Franco, Marcos, I mean, the list goes on and on. I guess the thing to do would be if the populace understood that by attaching themselves to this person, this despot, that they are enhancing the likelihood that they are going to die. Because ultimately, once these people get into power, they will turn on their allies, and they will also make life very difficult for the people. The people will starve. Brothers will kill brothers, and it ends up being a bloodbath that takes generations to recover from. I think that's the lesson. Like let's take, for instance, one of the most murderous despots of the 1900s is Stalin. So the first step is you eliminate the opposition. Whoever was that, well, we certainly have Putin doing some eliminating of opposition right at this moment. Then the next step after the opposition's under control is you start eliminating competition. And competition are the members of your party who are also powerful enough to be a threat to your power. So the despot will then methodically go about killing off the members of his party who put him in power in the first place, because he has to have sole power. And let's just say if there was a president who was a despot, the members of his party who were senators or ranking officials in the House, they're probably going to get killed too. I mean, it's always the case. They turn on the people who helped them get into power. They're going to eliminate. So despots, they have a certain program that they follow, whether it's today, the 1900s, or 2,400 years ago.
You know, whether they're literally killed or character assassinated and disposed of politically, the end result ultimately is the same, as we have seen with the so-called 30, the group of oligarchs that started out assuming power and ended up eliminating some of their own members who questioned the bloodlust and the absolute political intolerance towards anyone who questioned anything that they did. And there is the danger that when you subscribe to this sort of level of demagoguery and power lust, there's no end. You then have to, your confirmation bias then drives you to justify anything else that happens until it's too late to, until you end up the one being, being on the execution list, which is exactly what happened.
Right. So the citizens in the during these two civil wars in Athens, and plus more than half the population dies. I mean, you're just look at your family. Say, okay, I've got 6 members of my family. 3 of us are going to die if we attach ourselves to a despot. And then here's the trick. Most of the time, the despot ends up getting killed. In this instance, Critias and Alcibiades, they get, I mean, so let's say you make a deal with Sparta, and then once Sparta's done using you, they kill you. Let's say right now, let's say that you're a leader of a nation state and you cut a deal with Putin, and once Putin's done with you and you flee into his fold, he's going to get rid of you. Like once you've served the purpose, he's done. Yeah.
Certainly a lot of the traitors and a lot of the, a lot of the lesser known figures who have switched to sides ended up not doing well at the end of the day once they've outlived their usefulness. And people who think in terms of short-term gain, Alcibiades was fleeing from one crisis to another. There was never a path of smooth, transition that he was pursuing. It was always, he was stuck in some mess of his own doing every single time. If we ask ourselves at the end of the day whose side he was actually on after all these side switchings, it was his own. It was always his own, and ultimately he had no one left loyal to him. He was he ended up being, himself victimized by the very intrigues that he spawned in the first place. So, there's a lesson in that for anyone who follows that course of action. Usually just don't, because it's not likely to work out for you. Very few of such people end up dying of old age in their own beds, reaping, the success. And by the way, his whole half brother, based on what you tell me, also did not end well. His character assassination and smear campaigning brought him ultimately dishonor, and he lost everything he had accumulated to begin with.
Oh yeah, there's absolutely, like if you attach yourself to a strong man, the odds are that your life and your country's life is going to get a lot worse. His life will temporarily be better when he has all the riches and everything, but then most of the time, they end up getting got themselves. But let's say you die of, like Franco, of old age, your nation ends up in the gutter for generations. Like it takes a long time. So if you attach yourself to a demagogue, it may be until your your great grandchildren before there's any standard of living back in your country. Like it takes a while to heal.
At the end of the book, when we're discussing Socrates' final days before his execution, he leads with a very selfless example. He has an opportunity to escape before he ultimately is executed. He does not take the opportunity. He thinks rational about the consequences that it will bring to his family, to the people who facilitated his escape, and to the rule of law in general. If he, and he basically makes it clear in his speech that he makes a stark contrast to these self-serving characters about what is actually rationally good and ethical versus what appears to be for the public good but is actually entirely for the coincidental benefit that but mostly for the sake of these self-serving agendas. So this issue, unfortunately, because we still live in the world of shadows, people are still blinded by outward gestures, and they cannot tell constructive criticism and rational approach in irrational times from this the noise that is populated by these charismatic figures who were well known how to appeal to these short-term impulses. So this is something that we're still struggling with to this day. And Socrates' death, it brings back into a sharp contrast. But the question is, let's say the lesson is clear, still how do we get past this public blindness? Especially, you emphasize several times it's important to know the classics. Today's generations, it's obvious to me, just don't read, they don't know history, they don't study history, and when they do, they read it on such a shallow level that they draw all the wrong lessons and use various historical references with flagrant disregard for context and for nuance that is essential in drawing any sort of rational conclusion. So given this, given the fact that ignorance of detail, of nuance, is so much part of this populist demagoguery, how do we get people to become more rational? This is the question that even Socrates was not able to solve.
Well, I do hope some young people read this book. Santa Fe has St. John's College, where there are a bunch of young classicists. So I'm sort of surrounded by a populace that makes me hopeful. But yeah, I mean, ancient Athens if past is prologue, ancient Athens offers us a crash course in what not to do. And hopefully enough people will read this book and be like, whoa, I don't want that to happen. And, become civically engaged and vote and do things. I mean, because the truth is a lot of people in America don't vote. It's like, if you do care about your country, you should become politically active.
Mm-hmm. And
Yeah.
at the very least, educated enough to be able to make a choice that's not hoisted upon you by somebody else, and but by your own, thoughtful analysis. Hopeful. Again, we're living in an age when a lot of the decisions are driven by emotions, by social media, or equivalent of public opinion manipulation. There was smear campaigns, emotional assaults, and reactions rather than forward-looking analysis that Socrates so much um advocated, and certainly very little skepticism of claims, very little. There's you know there's suspicion, there's distrust, but there's not a healthy, thoughtful skepticism. There is a big difference between, distrust and skepticism, and we are facing a big challenge with either. But you manage in a single book to unravel a 2,000-year-old enigma. You manage to solve a murder case, an execution case, and give life to a character that most people have never even heard of outside, Socrates and a couple of his most famous students. And you managed to draw these incredible geopolitical parallels across, thousands of years and, times and different areas of the world to bring to today's context. Given that you accomplished all of that in one book, what's next for you? Is there anything left?
Oh, there's plenty left. There's plenty left. Yeah. So I'm working on it. I'm working on it.
Yeah, this could actually be, I could see this turning into a mini series or a movie. Is that something in your mind?
Well, maybe there's your answer. People who don't read books but maybe watch TV, they can learn the lessons that way. Maybe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, this was fantastic. I strongly recommend The Shadows of Socrates, even for those who are not particularly interested in philosophy, who think history is boring. You will find larger than life, grandiose characters who are as three-dimensional as anybody, any politician, a political figure, or would-be tyrant or real tyrant that you could see today. And I think many things are not only, you'll find everything that makes anything a draw. You'll find violence, torture, sex, egomaniacal personalities, intrigue, in courtroom drama. It's all in there. So there's everything for
Plus
anybody.
some deep thoughts.
Exactly, exactly. Behind all of this, somehow it also manages to bring very relevant, thoughts and questions into the limelight, and you even learn about light and the and the art and the ancient mysteries and religious rituals that you probably never even heard of. All of this in
Yeah.
one volume.
Never heard of the mysteries. It's because Christianity did a great job of erasing them as much as possible. Yeah.
Uh, and that may be a follow-up for the next book, I hope, because how
Yeah.
you allude, by the way, on different religious interconnections and issues, and how different religions would have related to some of the themes and religious elements at the time. It would be interesting to see something like that in more depth. Some of it is already par for the courses in college, but because this particular angle um is newly revealed in your book, maybe there is a time for more additional academic studies as well.
Right. Well, maybe I'll get around to writing a book about Moses.
That would be good. There's a few mysteries, artistic and otherwise, there as well, and or certainly lessons also about different leadership styles that could
Well,
be quite relevant.
mysteries of Eleusis. Remember, the Greek stuff is older than Moses. That this
Hmm.
is who Moses was arguing against. Like these mysteries are all over the ancient world, and that's what the Abrahamic tradition seeks to supplant. And that's a couple thousand years struggle because the um, mysteries don't get outlawed in the Roman Empire till in the 380s of the Common Era. So I mean,
Hmm.
it's a long battle. So you could, yeah, I don't know. We'll have to see. We'll have to see. But maybe Moses down the line somewhere. Who knows? Who knows? I'll
Absolutely.
have to we'll have to off camera have a conversation about what's next.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I strongly once again recommend this reading, and it's very accessible. It's not super academic or written in, in any stuffy style. On the contrary, it's a very accessible, very fun read. And I was imagining all these characters, as I was reading, and hopefully there's value for it in the giving life to history in this contemporary context. Learning these lessons will hopefully bring back better outcomes for our own decision making in the near future. Thank you, Matt, for joining us today. For those watching the program, thanks again. Please join us again next Tuesday, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thanks again, and have a great night.
Thank you. I appreciate you, Irina, and the Washington Outsider.